The polished mahogany of the family court bench reflected my father's smirk like dark water. "Your Honor," he said, his voice a weapon of polished condescension. "With all due respect, my daughter's claim to any meaningful role in the family trust is, frankly, a sentimental fantasy. She's a freelance researcher, a glorified librarian. She lacks the temperament, the acumen, and frankly, the maturity to handle the complexities of the Prescott legacy." He didn't even look at me. He addressed the judge, the heir. The history of the room that had always bent to his will. This was the final hearing to dissolve my parents' estate, 3 years after their sudden death in a sailing accident off Martha's Vineyard. My sister, Elara, sat beside him, a study in elegant sorrow in a tailored charcoal suit, a single, perfect tear tracing a path she'd likely practiced. She said nothing. Her silence was a deeper betrayal than his words. Our mother's will had been clear: a three-way split of the assets, including the controlling interest in Prescott Biotech. But a supplemental directive had surfaced, signed in a shaky hand during mother's final illness, naming Elara as sole executor and primary beneficiary. Citing my own stable career path and lack of conventional ambition, I'd spent every dime I had on a lawyer who was now fumbling with notes, outmatched by my father's battalion of Armani-clad attorneys. My father continued, warming to his performance. "We've offered Cassandra a generous stipend. More than enough for her little projects. This insistence on a board seat, on parity, it's a child's understanding of business. She tracks down old books for a living, let her be content with that." The judge, an older woman with wary eyes, shuffled papers. I felt the eyes of the gallery, aunt, uncles, family friends on me. The humiliation was a live wire under my skin. I was 10 years old again, showing him a straight A report card only to have him ask why it wasn't A less. I was 16, him laughing at my first business plan for a bookshop. I was 30, him toasting Elara's MBA while asking me if my historical digging paid the rent. The lawyer my father had hired for me, a final insult of pretended benevolence, stood and said, "My client is willing to accept the stipend, Your Honor, with a non-disclosure agreement." I hadn't agreed to that. I opened my mouth, a final, feeble protest dying in my throat. And then the judge looked up, not at my father, but at the court officer who had just handed her a note. She read it, her eyebrows lifting slightly. She looked directly at my father. "Mr. Prescott," she said, her voice slicing through his smug aura, "before we proceed, I feel I must ask, in your extensive assessment of your daughter's qualifications, did you or your counsel ever conduct a basic background check?" My father blinked, thrown. "Her qualifications are a matter of public record. Her tax returns, which we've submitted, show." "I'm not speaking of her taxes," the judge interrupted, a dry, almost imperceptible smile on her lips. She turned her gaze to me, and for the first time, it held something other than pity. It held curiosity. "Counsel, does your client have any current official affiliations she wishes to disclose to the court?" My court-appointed lawyer looked baffled. I straightened my spine, the cheap wool of my blazer scratching my neck. The room was utterly silent. I met my father's confused, irritated stare. Then I looked at the judge. "Your Honor," I said, my voice clear and steady for the first time that day. "I am a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy, Judge Advocate General's Corps. My work as a historical researcher is my cover for active duty intelligence analysis pertaining to financial and technological warfare." The gasp in the room was audible. My father's face went from smug to confused to a slow, dawning horror. Elara's perfect tear track froze on her cheek. The judge leaned forward, her eyes locking onto my father's. "Sir," she said, the word a velvet hammer, "you don't know she's JAG." She adjourned the hearing for recess. As my father and sister scrambled, whispering frantically to their lawyers, their empire of lies showing its first seismic crack, I sat perfectly still, the ghost of a 7-year oath to my country solid as steel in my veins. And that was the moment I knew, the real revenge begins now. The downpour began as I left the courthouse, a cold, biblical rain that turned the New York streets into rivers of reflected neon and blurred taillights. I didn't take the subway. I walked, letting the icy water soak through my inadequate suit, feeling it wash away the last vestiges of the persona they thought they knew, Cassandra, the dreamy, fragile scholar. Lieutenant Commander Cassandra Prescott, JG Corp's Financial Crimes Division, felt the familiar, coiled focus return. The cover was necessary, born from a genuine passion for historical patterns of fraud that the Navy found useful. My parents had known, vaguely, early on. But after a security briefing following my first major case, they'd agreed to obscurity. My father, I realized now, must have forgotten, dismissed it as a phase, buried it under his narrative of my failure. Elara might have suspected, but chose to ignore it, a convenient blindness. Their ignorance was my beachhead. I went not to my cozy, book-cluttered apartment in the West Village, but to a secure federal office, in a nondescript building in Lower Manhattan. My commanding officer, Captain David Joe, sat across from me in a soundproofed room. A map of global financial flows glowed on a monitor behind him. Prescott, he said, his voice gravelly. The court thing. I nodded. It's the same company, Prescott Biotech. The supplemental directive is a forgery. The trust irregularities I've been tracking for 6 months. The off-book transfers to numbered accounts in Liechtenstein. They originate from my family's office. Joe steepled his fingers. You're operational now. Your cover is compromised for them, but that gives you latitude. Objective. Twofold, sir. Personal justice. And to expose a conduit for illicit biotech capital laundering. I believe my sister Elara is the architect. My father is the blustering front. Joe granted me a 30-day detached duty. Burn it down, Commander. And bring me the ledger. The psychological warfare started in the quietest way. I sent a single email to the family's office manager, copying Elara and my father. It was a request for a formal, itemized accounting of all estate-related transactions over the past 48 months, citing my newly affirmed legal standing as a beneficiary. It was dry, bureaucratic, and perfectly lethal. It forced them to either comply and reveal their hand, or refuse and show guilt. Elara responded within the hour, inviting me to the family penthouse on Central Park West for a family conversation to clear the air. The trap was sprung, and she was walking right into it. The penthouse was a monument to chilly, acquired taste. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed a bruised sunset over the park. The air smelled of lemon polish and anxiety. My father, Robert, stood by the fireplace, a glass of bourbon in hand. His earlier courtroom fury banked into a smoldering resentment. A spy, Cassie. Really? Was all the bookishness just a sad little game? I ignored him. Elara glided in, wearing a cream-colored cashmere sweater and trousers, her blonde hair a perfect sweep. She looked like a corporate angel. Cassandra, she said, her voice a soothing balm. What a day. Let's not be adversarial. The will, it was Mother's confused wish. We were trying to protect the company's stability. For all of us, she poured me tea, her movements precise. This JG revelation, it's impressive. But surely it means you're even more committed to national security. Getting entangled in a messy, public probate fight, it could be seen as a conflict, couldn't it? Risking your security clearance. It was a threat, subtle and expert. Question my priorities, hint at professional ruin. I took the teacup. My clearance is fine, Elara. In fact, my work is what flagged the anomalies in the estate's finances. The transfers to Horizon Holdings in Vaduz. You're listed as the signing authority. Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes, the color of winter sea, iced over. Horizon is a strategic venture capital arm. Daddy knows all about it. Does he? I asked, turning to our father. Do you know that $23 million from Mother's liquid assets, which were to be split equally, went through Horizon, and never reappeared on the domestic books? That it corresponds with a deposit into the personal campaign fund of Senator James Corvin, who is currently sponsoring a bill that would fast-track approval for Prescott Biotech's new opioid alternative, a drug with troubling trial data you've been suppressing. The room went deathly quiet. My father's face was a confusion of rage and confusion. What is she talking about, Elara? Alara's composure was a terrifying thing. She set her cup down with a soft click. Cassandra has always had an overactive imagination. She's twisting legitimate business into some conspiracy. It's pathetic. But I saw the minute tremor in her hand. I had hit a nerve, but not the heart. The heart was protected by layers of legal padding and hidden alliances. I needed the root. I began a dual campaign. Overtly, as Cassandra, I filed a formal motion to contest the will, backed by a formidable civilian lawyer I hired with back pay the Navy provided. Covertly, as Leltsu Prescott, I used my resources to trace the digital ghosts of Alara's scheme. I tracked her lovers, a compromised FDA official, a hedge fund manager with ties to Eastern European syndicates. I pieced together a mosaic not just of inheritance theft, but of systemic corruption, with my family's company as the vehicle. Alara wasn't greedy. She was ambitious on a scale that dwarfed mere money. She wanted to build an empire insulated by political debt and blackmail. The pressure escalated. Anonymous tips about Prescott Biotech's faulty drug trials began appearing in financial blogs. The company's stock dipped. My father, increasingly unmoored, started lashing out. He called me drunk at 2 in the morning, ranting about ingratitude, his voice a slurry of insults. I recorded every call. But the crucial weapon came from an unexpected quarter, my aunt. My mother's reclusive sister, Helen. She summoned me to her cluttered, cat-filled brownstone in Brooklyn. She was a woman who had opted out of the Prescott madness. Your mother, she said, handing me a cup of terrible, strong tea, was scared at the end. Not of dying. Of Alara. She called me a week before the accident. Said Alara was pressuring her to sign papers. That Robert was too blinded by her success to see. She said she was going to change the will back, to put everything in a trust you would control, because you were the only one with a moral compass. Helen's eyes were bright with tears. She sent me something. A digital file. In case something happened. It was a voice memo, sent the night before my parents set sail. My mother's voice, strained but clear, Helen, it's Margot. I've hidden the real will with Martin Clay at the firm. The one naming Cassie as executor. Alara's version is a forgery. She had a nurse witness it when I was on heavy medication. I confronted Robert. He refused to believe it. He said I was being hysterical. Turning against our golden child, I'm scared. If anything happens to me, it wasn't an accident. The recording ended. Martin Clay was the family lawyer who had retired abruptly to Fiji a month after the funeral. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't just theft. It was premeditated. My parents' accident, the fog, the Coast Guard report, the unrecovered body of the hired captain. I now had the motive, the means, and a witness from the grave, but it was hearsay. I needed corroboration. I needed Alara to confess. To do that, I had to become the one thing she couldn't control, a bigger, more powerful version of herself. I used my J credentials to get a meeting with Senator Corvin's chief of staff, implying I had damaging information about my sister's bribes that could implicate the senator. It was a bluff with teeth. The resulting panic in Corvin's camp must have sparked a furious call to Alara. She retaliated by having me followed. I spotted the tail, a sleek black SUV, outside my apartment. Instead of shaking it, I led it on a tour of secure federal buildings, a silent message: I am not alone. The final move required a stage. The Prescott Biotech annual shareholders meeting was held at the Mandarin Oriental Ballroom. It was a spectacle of corporate theater. Alara, now officially CEO after a rushed board vote forcing our father into a chairman emeritus role, gave a keynote about innovation and integrity. I sat in the back. In my navy dress blues, my medals a silent, stark contrast to the room's soft wealth. The Q&A session was bland until I stood and approached the microphone. The room hushed. Hundreds of eyes stared at the unexpected military officer. Alara Prescott, I said, my voice amplified calm. A question about Horizon Holdings. Can you explain the $23 million transfer from the Margaret Prescott Memorial Trust on December 12 of last year, and its connection to the suppression of the adverse trial data for Neurothal? The room erupted. Cameras flashed. Alara, on stage, was a statue of perfect poise. but the teleprompter glass reflected the frantic scrambling of her aides. My father, in the front row, looked old and lost. That is a proprietary matter. And your figures are speculation, Alara said, her voice cutting through the noise. Your personal grievances, Cassandra, are not the concern of this company. This isn't personal, I said, pulling a small, government-issued audio player from my pocket. I didn't play my mother's recording. That was for later. I played a clip from one of my father's drunken rants, his voice slurred but recognizable over the ballroom's speakers. Alara handles the money. She always has. She said it was for political insurance. She said you were too weak to understand the real world. It was chaos. My father stood, shouting denials. Alara's mask finally cracked, a fissure of pure, undiluted hatred directed at me. Security moved toward me. I held up my hand, and two uniformed Naval Investigative Service officers, whom I'd arranged to be present, stepped forward. The corporate security halted. The aftermath was a controlled implosion. The S officers escorted Alara from the stage for questioning. The SEC froze the company's assets the next morning. My father, facing his own culpability and the horrifying possibility about his wife's death, had a breakdown. He tried to call me. I didn't answer. I sat with Captain Joe and a team from the Justice Department, handing over the evidence, the financial trails, my mother's recording, the analysis of the forged will. The case would take years, but the outcome was inevitable. I resigned my commission. The fight had taken a piece of my soul that service couldn't heal. With my inheritance restored, and the company placed in receivership, I sold my shares and used the money to found the Margot Prescott Foundation, funding independent clinical trials and addiction recovery centers. I moved to a quiet house in the Hudson Valley, where the only sounds are the wind and the turning of pages in old books. Sometimes, at night, I think of the courtroom, of that smirk wiped away by two letters JAG. Revenge wasn't a victory, it was an excavation. I had to dig through the rot of my own family to find the truth, and in doing so, I uncovered a corpse that was not just my parents, but the corpse of the sister I thought I had. The recording was the scalpel. But the hand that held it was steady, only because it had learned to hold a weapon for a country, not just for a self. The real revenge was the silence afterward. A vast, clean, and terribly lonely silence where the noise of their lies used to be. I had won. I had my name back. And in the hollowed-out space where my family once was, I was finally, painfully, free to build something true.